First of all, thank you so much to EPFL. It's a huge honor to be invited. And I greatly enjoyed the first two presentations, and I feel really honored to be in this group and to follow on from those talks. I think hopefully they set me up nicely in maybe just starting with a point of departure that as architects, we're kind of on the ground, and what we can say, and I think that increasingly we have to work very, very closely with scientists and engineers, because business as usual will not work anymore. We know this, and it's quite an emergency for us to transition our built environments to what we would call built ecologies. And what do we really mean by this? I'll start with a few controversial statements here, because I think maybe when we bring large groups of folks together from across the sort of the humanities, the social sciences, and the sciences, there's a widely divergent expectation in terms of what our stance will be entering into a debate or into a discussion. And of course, in the sciences, I think there's an expectation that we are expected to maintain some sort of objectivity or some sort of, or be very aware of our unconscious biases, let's say, in the process. And the polar opposite might be true in the cultural realm, such as architecture, where we might say, we might be, under a lot of pressure to make recommendations and to propose a certain way of doing things. So I'll just start with the sort of bias behind this work, which comes from our clients and which comes from the societies and the cultures within which we work, which is that there's sort of an urgent push that we can see all over the world in the cities that we work with and the clients and the communities that we work within, that we need to connect in different ways to non-human living systems. And most importantly, we need to bring in more biodiverse processes into urban environments. And there's so many different reasons, of course, for why we might do this. Maybe in the context of the previous talks, we could say an overriding emergency for urban environments is to reduce our carbon footprints, to reduce our urban heat island effects, to dramatically reduce the amount of energy that we use to maintain buildings and to build them. So our embodied energy and the energy all the way across the life cycle. And those are certainly very heavily motivating factors. Increasingly, a heavily motivating factor for us is also introducing opportunities for the growing of high density nutrition by communities and within buildings and in and around buildings. But what I'm going to focus on today is really the interrelationship between those factors and biodiversity, or designing with biodiversity for human health and well-being. And the reason I'm going to focus on this is a little bit because in the context, I think in the pandemic, I think we have sort of an increasing awareness around the world with the public that, these very sort of sequestered in so-called advanced societies or developed economies, we say so-called because we have a lot to learn from those that are considered underdeveloped in terms of how to coexist with natural systems, but we spend over 90% of our time indoors. And, the so-called biodiversity hypothesis is emerging, but we can see increasingly convincing data that there's a correlationship between all sorts of inflammatory illnesses and decline in immunity and the low biodiversity environments that we are creating in urban environments, and in particular in indoor environments. And that there's also a very tight correlationship between outdoor air quality, how we shape air quality in and around urban environments and inside. And ultimately, in a sense, we think that the sort of biochemistry of urban air, whether it's indoor and outdoor, is in a sense an indicator for so many aspects of the built environment process and the way that we've really come to build. And closer to our home here, we can say that there's quite an extreme condition. This is on the left-hand side a visualization of the island of Mannahatta in 1609. We can see sort of an ominous early warning of combustion technologies here, in case we think the right-hand side is so different from the left-hand side. In fact, we might say, even though we take 11,000 megawatts per day, roughly on average, to maintain this environment here in Manhattan, it is a direct linear trajectory, in our view, from the fact that we burn things to make things and we burn things to run things. So of course, one of our overriding factors is how do we eliminate combustion processes from the built environment cycle as a whole. But today, what we'll look at really is just how are we shaping this air? How are we shaping this air? And what are the ultimate impacts? If we're designing buildings and cities largely for humans thus far, and we would argue here that we've got to design urban environments for not just humans, but that we have an interconnection between humans and extended living systems. We're certainly not doing a very good job, right, maintaining or even understanding human health and well-being within these conditions. And let's say what might seem like a less, extreme environment than where we are in Manhattan. Even, let's say, in a relatively low density city like Zurich, we can see in closer to some of you on the phone, that they're in this longitudinal study looking at the relationship between mortality rates, which decreased with increasing floors. So literally, this is a huge social justice issue. How are we shaping air? We can see there's a catastrophic condition in cities like Manhattan or Beijing or others between floor heights and life expectancy. But in Switzerland, even between the first and the 8th floor, and in Zurich, we can see differences. For example, in many skimming flow environments, for example, in Europe, where you have equal heights, but they might be low, like Paris, we can see that one side, the leeward side of an urban canyon, is 4 times more polluted than the windward side. So you can see that literally people do not have access to the same kind of air. You cannot say open your window on one. If you are on the leeward side, maybe you might not want to open your window during high ozone days or other conditions. So that aspect literally of saying, how are we shaping the environment and what are we doing? In many conditions in urban environments, we might not be able to open the windows. We might have a catastrophic condition of a faulty mechanical system that has been allowed to degrade and become pathogenic. Even in the best maintained air conditioning systems, let's say 100% exterior air and very, very expensive filtration systems that are well maintained, we are taking potentially the good out with the bad. What does that mean? That even, for example, in cities like urban, very green cities, such as Helsinki or others. In Helsinki, with Hans et al., we've seen longitudinal studies showing a co-relationship between immunity and the presence of rare flowering plants. So that means that it's not just any old green that we're associated with or that we're exposed to. It means that we've co-evolved probably, in our hypothesis, once again, if we've co-evolved through this length of period to coexist with other living systems, that there are so many things that we do not know about how we are shaping our own physiology and health and well-being through built environments. Now, we've kept, despite this picture of recent constructions all over the world, we've kept living systems away from built environments for very, very important reasons. And I think actually the previous presentations are a very, very good example of why. It was, Jennifer talked about the complexity of even building information modeling, even trying to keep track, let's say, of mechanical systems, electrical systems, cyber infrastructure, et cetera, the overwhelming complexity, even before we had that overwhelming complexity, let's say, with contemporary buildings have always been complex. And what we've tried to do with built environments is we've tried to build buildings that would be predictable. We've tried to pretend they're static. We've tried to reduce the kind of the dynamics. Living systems are inherently dynamic and unpredictable in so many different ways, and they add a layer of complexity that has not been, we have not been able to, let's say, understand or control. So you might ask, what about all these systems? What about in some of ours? Actually, ours is one of our large green walls in the Bronx is right here. Another exterior wall is there. And this one, another one also, these are test beds. We are not in the business of pushing green walls. What we're or green infrastructure, what we're in the business at Yale Center for Ecosystems is partnering with large AEC firms in order to understand what is it that we're doing, because basically, as we said in the first slide, it's time to put green into cities for so many different reasons. That's not our decision. The cat is out of the bag, and the thirst for the connection with other living systems, so-called biophilia, has really exploded globally and worldwide throughout cities all over the world. And so how we would basically determine what green infrastructure is. Green infrastructure is any type of plant-based ecology that is integrated into the built environment process, either on the outside or on the inside. And what are the ostensible benefits? What are the goals? The goals can be productive, they can be regulating, and they can be cultural. We find, for example, that the cultural factors are overriding much more than some of the other ones. That even if there's no ostensible benefits to air quality, to water quality, to food production, et cetera, for aesthetic reasons, they will be specified and people will want them. On the other end of the spectrum, there's also a huge push globally for so-called urban agriculture, or even building integrated agriculture, very, very large scale biomass systems. We would say, for example, per some of the recommendations earlier, if you could plant trees, if you could, Addis Ababa, for example, a city that we work really closely with now in data, are doing incredible things with urban vegetation and planting and a sort of regreening of ecosystems. We can see the Great Green Wall across the Sahel region of Africa. These are amazing projects, and we are wholeheartedly for the idea that if you can plant trees, plant trees. However, within very built up environments all over the world, the opportunity to plant a big tree with a big root ball and with those, you can see, is very limited. So how and where would we pack biomass into already built environments? Within global cities, 80% of what you see today will be the infrastructure, the built infrastructure, the physical infrastructure in 2050. So we must think about how to retrofit our cities and change, in a sense, their metabolic signatures, if you will. What we say is basically we want to move from being counting, let's say, photons and electrons around the system, which is very, very important, but we also want to see how do they metabolize water, energy, and other factors. So our role at Yale is that we have at the Yale Center of Ecosystems and Architecture is that we are looking to accelerate the translation of fundamental advances in the lab to buildings and environments. We, in a sense, we're creating a highway between laboratory experiments and large-scale test beds, if you will. We call them building integrated test beds. Mostly because there are things that we can do by isolating variables or controlling experiments in the lab that really do not necessarily resemble the extreme complexity that we have in built environments and vice versa. So we can't control those variables all the time in open systems and buildings. So we want to really start to create what we call multi-scalar test beds. And what are the challenges really? Well, currently, we're sort of the legacy, and the built environment has done many things for us. Maybe we can say that's extend our lifespan or had a lot of things, but it's also deteriorated in many aspects. Our living living quality, and we would say we sort of broadly characterize the built environment process, or our kind of conventional process, as a kind of throughput economy of materials and energy. That is, we extract materials, the environment is degraded, we have a loss of biodiversity and so-called ecosystem services, and ecosystem and community resilience is low. And which is why we are very, very focused on working with communities and multiple stakeholders in the process. So governments, cities, all the way down to communities and individuals that can really help us and work with scientists. So this is not a citizen science necessarily. We can have citizen sciences, but we also need citizens with scientists to improve. So let's say in the labs and in in scientific inquiry, we're improving the characterization of dynamic biological systems, one of the major impediments to integrating them into built environment processes that lead to an acceptance or a tolerance for uncertainty. And I think in the previous presentation did an outstanding job of showing how important this issue of managing uncertainty has been in the development of built environment processes and values and the system of values. So could we have new methods and values that proactively support biodiversity and resilient living systems? One of the things we can do is if we're productively, producing certain things and reducing, let's say, the cost of mechanical systems or energy consumption, those could be new values. And then, of course, to us, we feel that there's what's very, very important, and this is an intangible maybe, is that sense of connection to a necessity of extended ecosystems, i.e. that we're not just in it for ourselves in the Anthropocene. We're not designing cities just for ourselves. We're designing cities and buildings for our relationship to extended living systems. And so that's a real shift, we hope, and that's what we work for in a sense in our relationships. And then we're trying ultimately to have socioeconomic transformation across distributed energy, food, et cetera, and ultimately ecosystem transformation. So what is needed to scale green infrastructure? This is just a little snapshot from a data management and knowledge, connecting data to knowledge management framework that we call socio-ecological visualization analytics, visual analytics. And it's just looking, is a snapshot of how we're trying to link models, model attributes. And I think as Jennifer said, to semantically enable these frameworks such that we can have many more stakeholders and many more types of models in the system, and that people can productively share data and knowledge, and that we can integrate and inform new data and knowledge into the process, such that, as I've said, the sort of biological systems can also be present with built environment, sort of classical built environment systems that you would think are in the sort of mechanical and electrical paradigm. So, and as I've said, we probably won't have time to get exactly into why, but there's very, very good reasons for why we separated largely sort of dynamics of built environment processes from, ecological, and sort of kept these very clear lines. It is very difficult to integrate. And so, we have all sorts of ideas, and a lot of them are social. Some of them are real technical scientific challenges of managing pests, managing microbial ecologies. And it's not a question of just putting a forest or putting a potted plant into, if you put a potted plant, for example, into especially a hospital with an immune compromised person, you will actually degrade the air quality and potentially put them at risk. So plants can be dangerous. It's true. So really, we are still talking about a highly engineered and scientific process. What goes into that, of course, is that the data and the models, really have to be cross-linked across literally global. As we know, urban air quality transcends geographic boundaries. And that urban geometries impact airborne risk factors to human health at street and within buildings. And so there's this tight correlation, as we said, between outdoor air quality that could be regional to literally all the way down to room conditions. Modern mechanical building systems, unfortunately, do often degrade indoor air quality. Unfortunately, they do some things very well, and then so once again, there's this interrelated, condition and very complex sort of relationship between source emissions. For example, if we have a very quick transition, for example, to electric vehicles, we might have a very, very different spatialization of pollutant types from the source emissions within urban canyons and other things. That could be a quite exciting outcome shortly. But also what we want to say that is that if we're looking at our developed systems, that we can look at them in a different way when we look at them through the lens of also multiple living systems. So right now, if we were to look at this map, we can say that today we've had a huge shift, let's say, from incandescent and fluorescent and other lighting types towards LED lighting types. However, and dramatically lowering our energy consumption profile within the lighting sector. But what has this done? It has exploded the impact of light pollution on flora and fauna regionally and globally, and also to our own health and well-being. There's a lot of interrelationships between, let's say, LED lighting and human health and well-being that is still yet to be really so understood. So we went forward with huge changes, right, to technology without really knowing what they are. On the flip side, we can say, we can look at this as a light pollution map, but then maybe from the standpoint of plant systems, certainly indoor plant systems, maybe this could also be a map of opportunities for indoor nighttime photosynthesis. So we're also constantly looking at the environment that we've created, and what are those opportunities to flip or change. So we're kind of, in a sense, being very pragmatic and very realistic about these kind of received conditions that we've created. And so I'll probably skip to this, but I think the ultimate issue is just also asking the question, what is the measurement that we are taking, and what is that measurement device? Ultimately, for a long time, many of our systems, and the LED lighting is a good example, where the overriding value was energy reduction in order to illuminate the environment. But increasingly, we in our work would like to use living systems as measurement devices to understand how are we doing, what are we doing, and we have incredible sort of explosion in both bioinformatics and in genomics and other fields where we have access to really sort of expanded data sets and extreme data sets. So as I've said, we cannot rely on traditional HVAC, because we know that it's way too energy intensive, it's material intensive, it leads to toxic loops of production of toxins, and it ultimately doesn't deliver what we need in the end, which is health and well-being. But we have we have a lot to understand about how are we going to work with plant systems in order to transition. I'm going to very quickly look at a test bed just as a kind of glimpse to see sort of how we are interfacing between scientific research and many different fields in scientific research with the test bed. So this test bed, for example, is the Public Safety Answering Center in Bronx, New York. So the Bronx was, in our world, was sort of the birthplace of social justice, because very early on, before we understood how we're shaping urban air quality through built environment, there were huge spate in the 60s and 70s of childhood asthma. And of course, initially it was blamed on the occupants, but we know that it is about an interscalar relationship between really poor external air quality and also building morphology and types. And so we are using this building, where this building unfortunately has a terrible sort of, like many high security buildings, embassies or other buildings around the world, to shut off the fresh air intake in case of any catastrophic event on the outside, such as a Fukushima or a 9/11 or a bioterror. Anything that might happen on the outside, you have to shut off fresh air intake. So it's a very highly controlled environment. We don't think that buildings should be cut off from their extended ecosystems at all, but it provides us with a very controlled, larger scale test bed, at which we would then, of course, cross-link with labs across, let's say, the scale of plant species, microbial ecologies, et cetera, to really understand what is that relationship between humans and non-human systems. So just as a kind of snapshot and as a pilot study, we were very surprised to see prior to scaling up for longitudinal studies at PSAC2 that we are even just with a small conference room that we tested with young students, so 20-something students, we're starting to take, you can see that there's kind of a chamber here that is outside of the student conference room. It's about, they do not know that plants are part of the study or involved in the study at all. But we're starting to take measurements, right, that kind of correlate the measurements between the microbial ecologies, the built environment measurements, human health measurements, and plant measurements. And so one of the things that was quite shocking to us is even within 1 hour, we could see changes in heart rate variability and respiratory rates in these very young subjects just by pumping air in. But it cannot be explained by the typical things that we would think. So for example, as we say, like we're working with a regular just HVAC, 100% exterior air. This is a lab building, so it's got a very, very sophisticated HVAC system. We're turning off HVAC, allowing CO2 levels and other aspects of the air quality to change over the course of 1 to 2 hours. And just to say also that we have certain standards. Every country has standards. We have standards for OSHA that will limit, for example, CO2 levels. We have recommended standards from ASHRAE, for example, it was an organization which would recommend healthy limits of CO2, and way below those levels of CO2, we saw a lot of impacts. Already, Satish et al. At Harvard and Syracuse University are showing that just 1,000 parts per million in higher CO2 level will affect executive functioning or other things. So what we were really merely looking to see with this pilot study as setting up for this large scale study is how many plants does it take really to change an ecology that would have a biostatistically significant impacts on health and well-being. What we find from this is contrary to a lot of the received literature that says you need a lot of plants, we only need 1 meter square to change, for example, CO2 levels from for 1,000 parts per million, as you can see here in the third day. So this is looking at just the rise of CO2 levels going all the way up to OSHA allowable standards are almost 5,000 parts per million. And the important thing, once again, here is that we saw these impacts in young subjects within an hour, and they could not have been necessarily explained by the rise in CO2. And what does that mean? What it means is there's something in these air streams that is biological and we don't know what it is. Why? Because we have basically not had the means prior to really study and to sequence the relationship between the human genome and non-human microbial ecologies. And so this is what we're really doing, is bringing together multiple fields, both scientific and engineering, to say, what is that relationship between species, growing media, the gestation of air through a living space and human occupants. And so just in a sense to kind of wrap up on the issue of like what kind of data. Well, data is obviously very, very difficult. Understanding different types of data, different ways of characterizing time or understanding time across fields and understanding significance is a major challenge. But I guess as architects, what we are really trying to support actually through our built projects. So these are studies that were supported literally by the built process. And this was just as a kind of political plug for, this is something that I personally learned living and working in Europe as a young architect in the 90s with the Mitterrand administration in France, where they had a certain budget for research in large public works projects. And this is so important, once again, that we really have different sectors coming together to support different types of research. Because whereas in our context in the United States, for example, we can get funding for very controlled studies, but there's kind of a mid-range between built environment and very controlled, where we really, really need a lot more funding to understand, what these are. And so in this case, it was funded by the City of New York, the Bloomberg administration, and there's ongoing towards the longitudinal studies to really sort of try to understand that interrelationship. And maybe the ultimate question that we're asking is it possible to reforestate from within the built environment where we don't have the opportunity anymore to plant large trees? We're spending most of our time indoors. We cannot catch a break with air quality, because if we open our windows in many of these large bottom parts of the urban canyons or even up top, we might not be able to, we might increase our exposure to toxics such as ozone and other things. And that on the inside even, we have these conditions where HVAC systems are taking out sort of beneficial microbes at the same time as they're taking out, let's say, unwanted pollen and other things. So how can we start to actually create experimental frameworks and support scientists to plug into experimental frameworks that are a little bit more open-ended and allowing for, let's say, more scales of inquiry and more more information into the process, and different types of data into the process. So as we said, as I said earlier, we're sort of looking at that multi-scalar relationship. This is a snapshot of the building in PSAC 2, or the inside of the building, where literally you can see that this is not quite a built system. It's actually more of an instrument, if you will, because we cannot, it's a high security building, so I cannot show how it's related to 2 classrooms, but basically this room, this wall is related to a classroom, which is a control that is comparing to just a classroom that gets serviced by the sort of very high-end contemporary HVAC system. These are sort of individual modules that can also, that in this particular case are all seeded from the same germ. It's the same plant, for example. So we're really looking at all those sort of plant treatments and the relationship between light, air, water, and microbes, etc. And sort of creating that loop to study these interrelationships, such that once again, if you where we started was that there's an explosion of urban integrated green. There's an explosion of interest in green, so-called green infrastructure. But from the scientific perspective, we really need to kind of take a step back, and we need to support very, very extended groups of multidisciplinary scientists to participate in the process, so that we sort of know what we're doing, and we're not sort of introducing unwanted complexity per the prior presentation, that the sort of issue of predictability, control, and understanding is necessarily a really important part of built environment process. Thank you.